Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
As per usual, Gary, I am absolutely fantastic. This week in particular, I am very good because I'm back to jiu-jitsu. Outdoor jiu-jitsu though. So that's a nice little touch, a bit of rain. You're trying to do some no-gi jiu-jitsu, which is obviously already incredibly slippy when people start sweating. But now we have a little bit of rain mixed in. So my entire game is gone because all I've got is pressure passing. And if you can't put your feet down and put your shoulder into someone's throat, you ain't got pressure passing. So the rain really doesn't help my game. Not that my game is that good. Just putting it out there. I'm like, now I have literally less of a game completely. But it was good to get back. My body is I was going to say in bits. It's not necessarily in bits, but there's all these little dings and stuff, like I'm getting a lot of bruises. I'm like, I forgot that the body, you got bruises, you know what I mean? It's like you kind of like, you go through your life, you're like, I don't bruise, but then you go to jiu-jitsu and you're like, oh no, fuck yeah, my body's actually incredibly weak. It's just basically a sack of jelly, but other than that, fantastic. The weather is getting better. How are you, Gary?
I'm excellent. I can't complain at all. I've been doing a good bit of jiu-jitsu myself and lifting, and I'm on the bulk train. So, I mean, life is good. So gaining weight, eating plenty of food, and yeah, jiu-jitsu is going well, having fun. I mean, we're indoors in my shed, a couple of us, just training away. So it's technically legal, I think now, because you're allowed 6 people in your back garden. So yeah, that's fun. And tomorrow I start on my neurosurgery placement in CUH for 3 weeks. So that's exciting too, although there was a ransomware attack on the HSE over the last few days. So I'm not sure how they're going to do neurosurgery in the absence of radiology systems. So I feel like my placement might be a bit of a letdown for the first week, but we'll see how it goes.
I didn't hear anything about that. What happened?
There was a ransomware attack on all HSE systems, and basically there's like all the systems are down. There's no like electronic files. You can't get blood reports back. You have to like triple check everything on paper. Like radiology is down. So basically, if there's anything involved in radiology, which is basically everything these days, interventional cardiology, fucking angiograms, MRI, etc. It all seems to be down, or at least significantly slowed. So yeah, whoever it was, basically they want a ransom from HSE. It's the largest cyber attack on the state in history, which is interesting. And they followed up then. Well, they don't know if it's the same group, but they attacked the Department of Health then today as well. So HSE and the Department of Health. So yeah, Ireland just got heavily trolled, but obviously not great if you're a cancer patient or anyone who needs like urgent care, because your appointments are basically delayed now and surgeries can't go ahead, etc. So yeah, not cool.
Fairly scum as well after a global pandemic.
It is a bit harsh. Like, I mean, you could pick better timing.
Yeah. But anyway, look, what are we going to talk about today? The thing that we're going to talk about today is, does fat loss even work? Right? Because look, we can fucking wax lyrical all day long and be like, this is how you lose fat, blah, blah, blah. We did an entire obesity series. We're now moving on to this more fat loss series. And it's an obvious enough question to ask, right? Because naturally enough, you talk to 10 people on the street, 9 out of them will probably tell you that, oh, I tried dieting before. And then they'll also say, it didn't work for me, So that can obviously lead you to the logical assumption that, okay, well, fat loss diets clearly don't work, right? But as we've discussed before, like, this obviously depends on how you actually define work, in terms of, it's like, are we talking short term? Are we talking long term? What's the end outcome? And as we'll probably conclude this episode, what you do for a fat loss diet is not the same stuff that you do to maintain that fat loss. And that often gets missed. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of confusion when trying to answer this overarching question, because people basically try to maintain their fat loss. They're like, oh yeah, I'm actually relatively happy that I lost 20 kilos, whatever. And they try to maintain that by doing the same stuff that, facilitated them losing 20 kilos, which probably isn't ideal in most cases, right? Especially the way most people set up fat loss diets. Anyway, look, we'll get stuck into it. What are your thoughts, Gary? Does fat loss even work? where do we even begin unpacking this?
Yes, fat loss works. Okay, that's it. That's the end of this podcast. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Now, does fat loss work all the time, or do approaches to fat loss work all the time, I should say? And there are rare exceptions where this is not the case. So you will hear people say online, for example, that a calorie deficit will absolutely lead to weight loss, like weight loss broadly. Some examples of where that wouldn't be the case would be, for example, in something like heart failure, certain kidney diseases, etc., where you have changes in fluid shift within the body that could lead to increases in weight independent of changes in body fat or energy expenditure, energy intake, etc. But they're obviously not the situations we're talking about when it comes to your typical kind of general population desiring fat loss. Now, it does occur on a more micro level, I guess you could say. An easy one there is the menstrual cycle, for example, when we have shifts in fluid balance, electrolyte balance. Again, that modifies weight independent of specific energy status, so to speak. But they're all kind of just changes in weight secondary to fluid shift, really. And the other, I guess, exception that's more specific to fat itself is a disease or condition that's referred to as lipedema. And this is a condition that you may have seen people with in the past, but may not have been able to identify. And basically, it's characterized by a pathological accumulation of adipose tissue or fat, typically in the lower limbs. And it's basically very compact fat that has a different texture to it. And it doesn't actually it's not readily released and broken down in the same way that standard healthy body fat tissue would be. And for these individuals, they can absolutely lose fat and lose weight, but that fat itself is very, very resistant to mobilization, and it's not necessarily subject to the same rules and regulations as normal healthy body fat. But that is a rare exception and is not applicable to most people, I guess. There are other conditions like lymphedema, for example, especially after cancer or different types of surgery. You can get lymphedema, but again, these aren't the typical situations that people are referring to. As we bring it back to the more kind of normal general population, does fat loss work, or do diets work? Approaches to fat loss work? Yes, they do, okay, with varying levels of success, and the trajectory of different approaches occurs at different rates, okay? So when you initially ask this question, as Paddy said, you have to figure out what you mean by work. And some of the ways that I think specific to the fitness industry that people will discuss calorie deficits and energy balance, they'll talk about, finding a calorie deficit and then sticking with that, okay? But as we'll get into in this discussion, it's actually like the level at which you're in a deficit or at maintenance is a dynamic number or a dynamic level. And what that means is that as you progress through a fat loss diet, not only is your body mass reducing and thus you're a smaller vessel burning less energy, but there's also a number of changes to hormones governing, anabolism, catabolism, energy expenditure, energy intake, how much you're moving, how much you're sweating, etc. All these variables are modified as you begin to diet. And then as a result, that's also going to modify your energy expenditure. So although you may have been in a calorie deficit at one point, you could actually be maintaining that level of calories very well, but your maintenance may have caught up with you. And the rate at which that happens varies between individuals for many different reasons. And I think there are some of the things that we want to cover in this podcast so that you can kind of get clear on why you may have stopped losing weight, because some people think that it's an inherent problem that they're not going to be able to overcome. They say, oh, I've reached starvation mode, for example, when in fact, they've just lost enough weight so that their maintenance has now caught up with the initial deficit that they set. So we'll touch on some more of that later in this episode.
Yeah, there's basically two things there's multiple things to unpack here, but there's kind of two overarching things that if you ask someone that says oh, I failed a diet, there's kind of two things that come out, right? And the first one is that they basically plateau, right? And they don't know what to do then afterwards, especially if they were very aggressive with their fat loss out the gate, they dropped 1,000 calories. Once you drop 1,000 calories from your diet, and let's say you're a relatively normal average person and you're eating 2,000, 2,500 calories. It's like, you don't give yourself a lot of wiggle room to, go down below that. It's like, what are you going to do? Eat less than 1,000 calories? It's like, probably not sustainable for a large chunk of people. Like, and I don't even mean sustainable for a long time. I mean, like, even for a day, 2 days, like eating 900 calories, it's not very filling, right? So that's the first thing. It's like, what are we talking about there in terms of failure? It's that kind of plateauing and then not knowing what to do going forward from that, right? And then the other failure point that in people's perception anyway is they reach their weight loss goal and then they're like, oh, cool. They slip back into poorer habits. They don't know how to maintain that. They don't know what to do with the diet. And we've actually kind of touched on that before when we did the obesity. Well, we've touched on a lot of stuff that we're going to cover in this episode when we walk through if I could even speak, when we talked through the obesity series in terms of like, the longer term, how to lose fat and that kind of stuff, right? But this is something that you need to take into account because obesity kind of seems like a different beast entirely, right? It's like, oh, well, obesity is not the same as just your average Joe and Jane trying to lose some body fat, right? It's like, no, this is we'll call it a disease state. That's how people view it. Now, it is to an extent, but it's not like, an actual disease state overall, although it can get pathological the further you let it go, right? But that's kind of not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the obesity stuff. We're actually just talking about your average person, the average type of person that would come to us and be like, right, oh, it's summertime. I want to lose a few pounds. I want to tone up. I want to build some muscle, blah, blah, blah. Just your average person, right? And you would think if your average person can't lose weight, right? They seem to have this perception that they can't lose weight. What do the people at the other end of the spectrum, like, or I should say at the end of the spectrum, they must find it really a hard thing to do, because if the average person is struggling with it, then the unaverage person is going to struggle with it more, especially on the we'll call it the fatter side of the spectrum, rather than the more, we'll call it jacked side of the spectrum. Like if you're this recreational athlete, it's like you probably have an easier time of fat loss than someone that's been obese for the last 20 years, because you've less to lose. You also have like, good training habits, etc. Right. So I suppose to kind of start this, especially continue on from the last few episodes that we've been doing together, Gary, is what goes on with the metabolism? Like what's going on metabolically? Like, or is there stuff going on metabolically that would make potentially fat loss harder? Because you touched on it there. Like one of the things is obviously as you lose weight, right? So you are a smaller human overall. And as we talked about in the last few podcasts and also in the obesity series, it's like, it's kind of a misnomer when people say that you have a slow metabolism if you are heavier, when in reality it's like, no, your metabolism is fucking cranking. It's like it's going because you weigh more. So if you're just walking down the street, you have to burn more calories to do that same 100 whatever steps. It's like you're burning more, therefore your metabolism is higher. So like what's going on here, Gary? Like, are there metabolic adaptations that we need to be aware of when we're trying to lose fat?
Absolutely. And you've probably felt or experienced some of these yourself, even if you weren't aware specifically why it was happening. But the first one, I guess, to touch on, which isn't necessarily that meaningful or modifiable, so to speak, is the thermic effect of feeding. So we discussed that in a previous podcast. We said that the thermic effect of feeding, or diet-induced thermogenesis, was effectively the amount of energy that's burned as a result of consuming, digesting, processing food. Okay. So for example, if you're consuming a 4,000 calorie diet, you're obviously going to require more energy to break down all that food, to undertake all the digestive processes and bring all those nutrients to where they need to go, than if you're on a 1,000 calorie diet. Okay, obviously. So there's a natural decline in your diet-induced thermogenesis or thermic effect of feeding as you begin to reduce your calories. But this is an absolute reduction, but relatively it's maintained. Okay, so it's basically scales more or less linearly with the level of calories that you're consuming, provided we're maintaining the same macronutrient composition. Okay, so that's not necessarily something to worry about as such, because it just kind of is, and some of the things that you could improve with regards to diet-induced thermogenesis are already baked into the rest of your nutrition recommendations. For example, consuming more protein can enhance the thermic effect of feeding, but that's something you would want to be doing for various other reasons. The same can be said for fiber, and it's kind of a bit more complicated with fiber, but fiber again is something that can increase the thermic effect of feeding or diet-induced thermogenesis to some degree. But again, we'd be recommending that anyway. So standard nutritional recommendations apply effectively. Basal metabolic rate does go down as well. We touched on in the last podcast, your basal metabolic rate is effectively the energy required to sustain basic bodily processes. Okay, so if you're lying down, that doesn't mean you're burning more energy, because your heart's still beating, your kidneys are still functioning, your brain is functioning, etc. So all of that still requires energy. And it does go down with dieting. And it seems to go down a little bit more than would scale specifically with body weight, for example. So that means there is, a compensatory decrease. Okay, there's an extra little bit that drops, and recovery of that takes place after refeeding, but it may not reach full recovery if you haven't, let's say, actually recovered your calories to an adequate level. Now, how important that is sort of dependent on how lean you get as well, because drops in basal metabolic rate might be much more pronounced if you've gone from 20% body fat, let's say, as a male, down to 4% with veins on your abs for a bodybuilding show. Okay, there's going to be far more pronounced differences there. But I guess just to know that that is something that is modified. But again, it's something that we can't really, we don't have much wiggle room in terms of changing either, okay, because it's subconscious effectively. Now, the next
just on that, we should also remember, just to re-highlight, we talked about in a previous episode, that like the biggest correlate with like basal metabolic rate is like body mass, well, lean body mass, I should say, right? So like that is important to remember, because that also does influence how we approach a diet, because we don't want to basically just become a smaller version of ourselves. We want to ideally build some muscle along the way, because that's actually going to ideally, hopefully, keep that basal metabolic rate in a good place, because you're either retaining the amount of lean mass that you have. Now, lean mass is more than just muscle, but obviously like muscle is a little bit more modifiable than, I don't know, fucking liver size or something, So it's like we can do stuff to impact on that. So it is a variable that we need to be aware of. But like Gary said earlier on about like the thermic effect of feeding, is like, this is already part of our general recommendations. One of the reasons we want to get enough protein on the diet is so that we can actually maintain the amount of muscle mass that we have. One of the reasons we generally recommend resistance training on a diet is because, again, maintenance of that muscle mass. And especially if you are an individual who has never done resistance training and you're like, oh, I've tried dieting beforehand, and you're just like, I basically just became a smaller version of myself. Like I didn't have the shape, the tone, the whatever that I wanted. Like resistance training is going to be your way to get there. And as we discussed in a previous podcast, like it is one of those things that people kind of overblow the effects of it. It's like, people are like, oh, gain a kilo of muscle and, your metabolism will be on fire, blah, blah, blah. And that's not really the case. I think it's like 50 extra calories per kilo, something like that, which obviously like that's significant over time. But we have to remember that it's not just a case of having that muscle. It's also the case of, first of all, having to move that muscle around, like you now weigh a kilo extra, but then also in the process of trying to build 1 kilo of actual contractile tissue, like you put a lot of energy demands into that. Like I would love to be able to gain a kilo of muscle, like there's a lot of energy that goes into gaining that, and it is actually rather significant. But anyway, that was just hopefully a nice little reminder that lean mass is important when we're looking at basal metabolic rate. But like Gary said, there is this kind of overshoot while dieting, and there's a few mechanisms for this. Like you can dive into the research. You can also see some like I was going to say disagreement between different scientists and how much of a magnitude of effect this is, what's going on, etc. Like it is one of those things where it's like, this is kind of an unanswered question, and we'll touch on a few things, hopefully anyway, that could potentially play into this. And we have also touched on some other things that potentially play into this, such as, in previous episodes, such as like, the metabolic efficiency that you're like, mitochondria has, like mitochondrial efficiency, proton leakage and stuff. And it's like, this is variable between individuals. But again, there is some leeway here. So it's not just we have the perfect predictive model overall. And that is something to be aware of. Anyway, Gary, sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah, but it is a good point to bring up, because I think that sometimes when you get down to that level of like looking molecularly at the expression of uncoupling proteins and stuff, it can seem like it's totally irrelevant, but it actually is relevant, because there is research on this where if you, and just to, I guess, quickly recap on what you mean, like when we talk about metabolic efficiency, or specifically mitochondrial efficiency here, what we're referring to is, if we have a unit of energy substrate, let's say it's glucose, basically how much ATP are we getting out of that? How efficient is that machine running versus just wasting it through the production of extra heat, okay? Because that just wouldn't be very effective. If you're constantly just giving off heat as energy, you're not getting the maximum amount of ATP, which is fueling your cells, okay? And the expression of these uncoupling proteins, as the name suggests, it basically uncouples that relationship between the energy substrate and the ATP that's produced. If you have more of those uncoupling proteins at baseline, that somewhat predicts how responsive you'll be to a diet. And there is research on this where the researchers will look at the baseline expression of these uncoupling proteins and look at how those who have lower versus higher expression respond to a diet. And it's actually the case that people who have higher expression of these will do better. So there is practical relevance at the real world level when you do zoom out. And one of the other things that's interesting, I suppose, given the theme of this podcast, is that what you do see is that following weight loss, and once someone gets to that new steady body weight, there is actually a decrease in the expression of those uncoupling proteins, demonstrating to you that not only is this a variable that at baseline might predict outcomes, but also that it's modifiable. So it makes sense when you think about it, because if you've got, lower energy status, your cellular machinery is effectively trying to be as efficient as possible so as to not waste any of the energy substrates that are coming in. So as a result, you get an increase in that efficiency, which is a really good thing evolutionarily, but not a great thing if you're trying to maximize body fat loss, obviously. So yeah, they're just some things to keep in mind. You don't need to know all the molecular mechanisms, but it's interesting to zoom out and see that it actually does have practical importance. Now, other than that, one of the things that I guess is there's two different components to this, but if we think of movement generally, some of that is conscious, some of it's subconscious, and then some of the conscious component of that is also not necessarily intentional exercise, okay? And the way, like, this is broken down in using different terminology, but I think simple way of looking at it is exercise activity thermogenesis and non-exercise activity thermogenesis. You'll have heard the phrase NEAT before, very likely if you've been in the fitness space, and that's what that refers to, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So exercise activity thermogenesis is very easy to understand. This is the amount of calorie that's burned through intentional exercise. So that can be your weight training, it can be your cycling, whatever you're doing that's intentional exercise. It may also be the act of you actually getting your steps in. And to be honest, like, it really is just kind of being pedantic for research purposes, because obviously a lot of people, when you hear them discuss their NEAT or getting their NEAT up, they count their steps as non-exercise activity thermogenesis, but it clearly is an intentional effort to get your exercise up. But I mean, I don't care what you call it. Ultimately, it's all the same, really. Like, you're just trying to get your activity up. So the exercise activity thermogenesis is effectively those conscious elements. We could put steps in there, or we could put it in the other one. But the reason they're kind of split into two like that is because non-exercise activity thermogenesis is basically non-intentional exercise. So it may be activity, but it's not necessarily exercise. So if you have to go out and do the lawn, if you're, doing the laundry, the dishes, even just me, like, fidgeting here, if you're watching the video, you'll see I'm moving a lot with my hands with the pen and stuff. I look quite animated. All those sorts of things fall under that bracket of non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Also, like, tapping your foot under the desk, blinking, etc. All those things are non-exercise, because yes, they're activity and yes, they burn calories, but it's not necessarily intentionally for that purpose, okay? And the reason that's so important is because very clearly, exercise activity thermogenesis, like that intentional aspect, that's really within your control, okay? Because everyone clearly has the agency to be able to decide whether or not they're going to go and exercise, okay? People have that decision. It's your choice. You have a choice whether or not you're going to do 10,000 steps per day, okay? Obviously within limits. But non-exercise activity thermogenesis is actually not so much within your choice. Like, you don't decide when you blink. You don't always decide when you tap your foot under the desk. You know, even having to do things like yard work or cutting the lawn, etc. Like I mentioned, like, yes, they're intentional activities, they're not intentional exercise. And what you see is that those activities actually go down a lot during dieting, and particularly in some individuals, where you'll just find yourself not being willing to do those different types of things, relaxing more, even adopting more like reclined position when you're sitting down, just basically trying to minimize muscular work and energy expenditure. And again, that is something that is susceptible to considerable variability. And that's one of those reasons that we suggest very often people trying to be conscious about getting their steps up, because it's a way of trying to compensate for some of that loss of activity.
Yeah, and just on that, like the neat stuff, like the non-exercise stuff, it's probably most apparent how much this, or how variable this is, when you know like competitive bodybuilders. Like obviously we know a lot of competitive bodybuilders, and you'll see competitive bodybuilders like very close to a show, like let's say within 3 weeks out, right? So they're like, you know, they're basically at this stage they've no body fat for all intents and purposes, right? And like you genuinely could see a car crash in front of you, right? And if you're standing beside a competitive bodybuilder, like they probably wouldn't even turn their head to look at it, you know? Like they're just like, I'm not putting forth that much energy, you know? Anything could happen, and they'd just be like, no, you know, like there's so little extraneous movement going on. They're just not, they don't have the energy for it. And well, they do have technically the energy for it because they are still eating and stuff, but their body's like, no, we need to fucking shut down anything that's unnecessary, except for like the survival stuff. Or in their head, they're like, I need to get my steps in, I need to go to the gym, blah blah blah, you know, like they still do that stuff, and usually with the help of copious amounts of stimulants, but that's another story, right? So the neat stuff, it's really important to understand to this whole conversation, because like Gary said, that's kind of the one that you have the least control over, right? Because like, again, like you have control over how much you exercise. Now, again, that's not the extent of it. Obviously there's constraints to that. Like, it's like, you can't just be like, oh yeah, sorry kids, I have to go exercise for another 30 minutes or whatever, you know, like obviously there are constraints to that for real life. But what we mean is like the ability to exercise, like you can still control that. You can still go, I need to burn 1,000 calories today. Like you can go burn that 1,000 calories intentionally, in terms of go do some cardio or lift weights or whatever it is that you want to do to burn that 1,000 calories. But you don't really control, like Gary said, the amount of times you blink. You don't control like how much you're moving around. Like, you know, like again, like it's very variable depending on your life. Like you could have a very, like, we'll call it reactive job, you know, where you have to go around, walk around, investigate things, or get things out of a filing cabinet, blah, 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 whatever it is. And like some days your activity might be, you know, huge. Some days they might be low. Like you don't really control that, even though you control going to work, you know, or whatever it is, right? So there's a huge amount more variability to this. And this is unfortunately the linchpin of why people, well, again, solving one of the questions that we have about why diets fail. And like Gary kind of alluded to there earlier on, it's like this is an evolutionarily advantageous thing to occur, right? This kind of metabolic adaptation, right? And do you have anything else to say on the metabolism before I move on to this now?
Go ahead.
So the like metabolic adaptations that occur, like this is beneficial for your survival, right? This is something that technically you want, you know, technically you don't want if you're trying to lose fat, but technically you want in case there's like, I don't know, fucking nuclear war or something, and you know we're having to walk for hundreds of miles to you know, survive, right? Whatever, right? Like you want to have a metabolism that adapts, right? You want to be one that goes, oh, food is low, that means my activity is low, I'm going to conserve energy. Like that's what you want, right? You do not want a lack of conservation of energy. You do not want someone that just burns off thousands of calories every single day. Like we've discussed it before on the podcast, like Gary has a more adaptive metabolism than I do, right? Like when I'm dieting down, I'll still keep moving around the same amount, like I'll still just fidget around, still do whatever. And like, I'll basically fidget myself to death, right? Whereas Gary would, stop moving a bit more. Like he stopped sweating and stuff, like again, like that's something you don't have active control over, right? Whereas I would just sweat myself into a fucking early death if we had to, survive, right? So, and this is most apparent when they do like, or when they do, I suppose that's not the right terminology, but when they research concentration camps and stuff, it's like, oh, well, who died faster? It's like, oh, these are all the ones that have less adaptive metabolisms. The ones that survived are the ones that could, regulate their energy expenditure. They could down regulate it, right? So it is a benefit, right? It's a real benefit to have an adaptive metabolism, except if we live in the modern world where food is freely available and it becomes harder to lose fat. And I have loads of clients, like obviously the two of us coach a lot of people, right? And we have coached a lot of people, so we see this more often. Like you'll see the differences in how people's metabolism reacts to given calorie changes. Like I might have one client and be like, right, we're going to drop it like 200 calories out of the diet. We've been losing that, whatever, 300 grams to 500 grams per week, but we want to be losing that like 700 to, a kilo per week, right? We're just like, we'll just say that's what we're doing, right? And I'll be like, right, we need to just drop out about 200 calories. We want to make these habit changes. We're going to do X, Y, Z, whatever, right? And you'll see some people and they'll just go, boom, right, we drop that out. They get the exact fat loss that we predicted based on 200 calorie drop. It's like, this is like as if I have a magic wand and I'm like, we have it fucking down to a perfect science, right? Whereas the next person you'll see, I drop it, I go 200 calories less, and then they're like, oh yeah, my body weight did not change this week. You're like, what the fuck happened there? And you're like, okay, we'll give it another week because, fluid changes, stool volume, like maybe they increased veg to compensate for less starchy carbs, like different things that can happen. And then they're like, the next week, they're like, no, like I only dropped like, 100 grams this week or something. You're like, what the fuck? Like, how is this happening? I thought I would have seen a bigger jump. And like, I'm obviously, exaggerating a little bit here, but you know what I mean? Like there's people out there that their metabolism is just a bit more adaptive to the changes that we make. Now, usually it doesn't happen within a week. Like that's, again, me being like hyperbolic with this, but you will see people that are like, one guy can diet for 20 weeks on the exact same calories, and it's like we get the exact same predicted weight loss that we want, whereas this other person diets for 3 weeks and then all of a sudden weight loss completely stalls out, right? Especially if you're trying to be more aggressive with this stuff, right? If you're trying to drop like, I don't know, you're trying to drop over a kilo per week, all of a sudden they're like, no, body's dropping nothing now, whereas perhaps if you had taken it a little bit slower, you could get more out of it. So there are some variables here that we need to be aware of. But the main thing I want you to get into your head is that we do have this adaptive component to metabolism. And one of the things that changes most with this is that NEAT, that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, right? That's why we structured the conversation like this, because again, using those same two examples, we both drop off 200 calories. Both those individuals, they weigh the same, they exercise the same, etc. They're like, right, cool, I have to go into the gym, I have to do these exercises. They put forth the energy into that. They have to, burn off what I'll say 200 calories of cardio at the end of their workout, whatever, right? So we're standardizing the amount that they actually exercise in terms of calorie burn or energy expenditure, right? And then we also go, oh, well, we want to look after NEAT, because we're fit fam here, so we're going to track our steps. So we both get them to do 10,000 steps per day, right? It's like, yeah, cool, do that. And we still see this change in metabolism. And even though we've technically standardized NEAT, by keeping the steps the same, there's no way that I can standardize blinking. There's no way that I can standardize the amount of times that you get up to go to the toilet. Because this is stuff that happens. Like someone with an adaptive metabolism will go, oh yeah, I need to pee, but they're basically waited out a little bit longer, whereas someone who's like, oh, I'm full of beans, full of energy. Oh yeah, I need to pee. I'll just go pee. I don't care if I have to walk to the toilet again in 30 minutes or an hour. Whereas the individual that's like, oh, my metabolism is like very adaptive, it's slowing down. They're going to be like, right, I need to like ration out the amount of energy that I'm going to expend walking to the toilet and stuff, and like, this is not under conscious control. This is, we'll call it subconscious. It's just what your body is doing. It's the signals that your body is giving out. And unfortunately, some people have this adaptive metabolism. I say unfortunately in the modern world. However, if the fucking tables turned overnight, you guys with an adaptive metabolism are going to be in a fucking great position to actually survive. So we need people with adaptive metabolisms to continue, life. So it is something that it can be difficult for individuals trying to lose weight or fat in particular, but it is actually technically a benefit, right? And I just want that to be the thought process that you get into this, where it's like, okay, some people are going to have adaptive metabolisms, some people are going to adapt quicker, some people are going to adapt slower. There's always going to be some degree of slowing or adaptation of the metabolism. It's not like I literally will just exude heat the exact same rate. Like when I get leaner, like my body temperature, etc., does go down, obviously. But again, it's going to be different for everyone. And that is something that we have to take account of. And there are practices, there are ways that we can structure the diet so that this is less of a concern. And we've talked about these before in terms of like, there used to be a thought process of like using refeeds for this, and that can work, but those refeeds have to generally be over 3 days. And even then, I would probably be like, right, let's just do an actual week, like we'll call it a diet break, because people generally call it a week, a diet break. But we'll just say we're going to do a diet break. And what we do, and like we teach this on the Coaches Corner as well, where it's like we tell people or teach them how to structure a diet so that you have blocks of time where it's like, this is when we're going to push the diet, this is when we're going to take a step back, and we're going to have like, a diet break. We're going to eat at maintenance, so we basically wash off some of this metabolic adaptation that has occurred. Now, it's not going to get rid of everything, because you are generally going to be lighter. You're generally going to have some, there's other things that are going on. And a week is not just, going to fix everything. Maybe it's going to be a month, maybe it's 2 months. Again, it depends on how lean you are, the exact specifics, right? But it is something to be aware of, that we do have practices to potentially overcome this. And that kind of goes into when I said there was kind of 2 questions that we're answering with, do diets work, or does fat loss even work? The second thing is, like, if you structure things correctly, it does work more, or it does work better than if you structure things incorrectly, or you have a diet structure that is, great for fat loss initially, but not great for maintaining that fat loss longer term, right? But anyway, Gary, do you have anything to say on that kind of adaptive metabolism component?
Just to say quickly, I suppose that it does also work in the opposite direction. It's not the purpose of this podcast, but I know that, some of you will have experienced this when gaining weight. Like for me, it affects me way more when in a surplus than in a deficit. Like, yeah, there will be some adaptation when in a deficit, but personally, once I start to bump my calories up, like my maintenance starts to catch up with me super quickly. I start to sweat like an absolute animal. I just took so much energy to train, feel invincible. Obviously, that's only to a point. Then you train too much and you feel totally goosed. But yeah, that is something that massively impacts me, and there can be a huge difference between the amount I require in a surplus and the amount I require in a deficit, because of that adaptation that works on both sides. And although it would seem really convenient to think that some people just adapt on the way down, and some people just adapt on the way up, I think that's the way people typically think of it. Like, for example, those who adapt on the way up when they're overfeeding, you typically consider these to be your hard gainers, so to speak. And those who adapt really quickly on the way down would be those who struggle to lose weight. But there's a bit of a spectrum there, and then you can be mixed as well. So it's very difficult to just say clear cut where you fit into that box.
Yeah, and in my experience, I'm like, it's usually the people that struggle on the way down, they also struggle on the way up, in terms of, it's like you said as well, it's like you find that your metabolism adapts on the way down, and then it also adapts on the way up, right? It's usually they notice both. Now, like you said, it's usually, or it's not usually the case, it is oftentimes the case that one or other of those will be more adaptive, right? Like you're saying, like you're more adaptive on the way up, but you still do notice the adaptations on the way down, like I have had clients that are the same, where they're like, oh, on the way down, they struggle with the fat loss, the adaptations kick in, but then we increase calories. We're like, oh, well, we predict maintenance is at this level. We increase calories, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh no, I'm actually still losing weight. And you're like, okay. And then you go, oh, I'll increase calories again. And you're like, we're still losing weight. You're like, okay, what the fuck's going on here? And in reality, it's just because now all of a sudden their training sessions are so much more intense. Like they're using something like, I don't know, like an Apple Watch or something, which, you know, tracks their calories. It's like they were training hard on the way down. They were like, yeah, I'm putting as much energy as I can into this. But then all of a sudden you give them more calories, and all of a sudden their 500 calorie gym session, it turns into this fucking 1,500 calorie gym session that they're just fucking throwing weights around. And it's like, this is like, everything is now going, you know, at 100%, even though we're trying to gain weight now or trying to just find maintenance. It's like you're actually expending way more energy. And again, it's hard to, like, I can't say that that's going to be a great tool to use. Like, that's fantastic if we could just be like, right, we're going to go aggressive with the diet, and then I'm going to make myself look like a magician by increasing calories, and all of a sudden fat loss, you know, rockets along. It's like there's no way to kind of predict that ahead of time, you know. But I always call it that kind of rebound energy expenditure, and a lot of people do experience that, especially as they wash off some of the fatigue of dieting down. All of a sudden, within a week, 2 weeks, they're like, I thought my maintenance was at this level, but all of a sudden my maintenance is at, you know, 500 above where I thought it was supposed to be. And you're like, what's going on there? And again, it's just because you're actually just getting rid of all these metabolic adaptations, which again is important to know, because it answers that second question of like, why do diets fail? And again, people don't know how to structure a diet after the diet ends. People think, I'm going to have to stay on these 1,200 calories, 1,400 calories, whatever it is, restrictive diet that they've been on. Like, I have to stay on that for the rest of my life. And in reality, that's not necessarily the case. Like, you could be actually losing weight on much higher calories after the fact, purely because you get rid of all that metabolic adaptations, or get rid of all of those metabolic adaptations, I should say. And then also you start really fueling training. All of a sudden you're getting stronger, blah, blah, blah. You start progressing that. You get effectively more lean mass because you're able to, you know, get stronger. You're able to fill up those muscles with glycogen, etc. You know, so it is important to understand that the metabolism is adaptive. This is a component that leads to so much frustration in the fat loss world. And unfortunately, it's not a case of, I can predict this ahead of time. You know, if that was the case and I could tell you that, fuck me, I'd be a millionaire. You know, I'd be like, oh, you've got an adaptive metabolism. This is exactly how we need to structure your diet. These are the tweaks we're going to make. If I knew how to do that, we wouldn't be fucking on a podcast here. You know, we would be in the Bahamas sipping on fucking Mai Tais or fucking whatever, you know? So, well, actually, myself and Gary don't like the seaside. Well, we don't not like the seaside. We'd be up in the hills somewhere.
I would be in the hills with around a campfire, you know.
Exactly, the fucking ideal. In the fucking forest, in the backcountry, somewhere no one could ever find us. But anyway, look, we won't get off track. So that's for after the podcast. We'll discuss that. But this is something to understand if you are on a fat loss diet. It's like, look, you might have an adaptive metabolism. I don't know. I'm not your coach. Like, I know all my clients. I'm like, I know if they have somewhat of an adaptive metabolic qualities. I know based on coaching them, because I'm like, you know, looking at the progress. Like, I can think of a client right now where I'm like, literally today, I had to just like send him an email where it was like, look, you are actually still losing weight. You know, it's like, you feel like you're not because you have a more adaptive metabolism, you know. I'm like, I can see the trend here. We are still moving in the right direction. It's just that it's not going as fast as you predicted. And you have to kind of push calories a little bit harder because your metabolism adapts a little bit quicker. But I also know as soon as we go back into gaining, because I've been coaching them for like 4 years, I'm like, as soon as we go back into gaining, you know, or, you know, adding more calories in, I'm like, all of a sudden you're going to be like, oh, I can't stop fucking training so hard. I feel fucking great. I'm like, you know, I'm like, I know this is coming down the road. And it's just, we have to get through the fact that on the way down, things are a little bit harder for you, you know? So adaptive metabolisms, they are a thing. It's important to understand, is there predicted or is there a way to predict this stuff? I don't have one. Do you, Gary?
No, unless we start just like literally doing genetic sequencing, PCR, and all this sort of stuff with our clients.
And even then, it's like, it's not like we have all of the genetic data. You know, it's like people always think it's like, oh, science is so advanced, blah, blah, blah. And science is advanced. But like, if you actually look at like the human genome, it's like, do you genuinely think that we know every single thing that all of these are doing? Because we don't. Like, there's all these kind of like post-translational modifications. It's like, you might have these genes, but then the way it's actually expressed in your body is not the way that you would predict, because you also have these other genes that we didn't even know interacted, but they actually interact like post-translationally when you've actually, you know, translated, quote unquote, your genes into like the proteins and stuff, you know? So it's like, there's so much more that goes on than initially was thought, you know? And we don't have all the answers yet, you know, with like systems biology and stuff. We're getting closer and closer to seeing the fucking mind of God. But anyway, it's not like we have that data. We can't predict it right now, unfortunately. Maybe in the future, but unfortunately right now we don't have that, right? So that was the first thing. I think that's people are very aware now of metabolisms. That's why fat loss doesn't work, right? Like that's the biggest reason. People's NEAT goes down. That's, I'd say 90% of the reason where people plateau. It's like all of a sudden their NEAT goes down, assuming they have some idea of like calories and macros. Like realistically, the reason most people fail is because they try to eat healthily, quote unquote healthily, and they just end up eating the same amount of calories. You know, it's like you just changed your food source. You didn't actually change your calories, you know, which is, again, that's potentially beneficial. Like I'm always going to advocate people eat a healthier, like quote unquote healthier food selection choices, etc. But if you're trying to manipulate your body composition, you need to change calories in some way, right? So that's probably why most people fail. The second reason is that they don't account for NEAT. And this is something that, especially in the past, before like the really came to the forefront, like I remember this is literally how myself and Gary came into business, was talking about NEAT, you know, like we've talked about it before in terms of like, we were talking about it in a group on Facebook called Irish Fit Fam, which we both got kicked out of, which is, you know, depressing enough because I want to relive and rekindle I actually just want to get a screenshot of that initial conversation. But anyway, look, I digress. That is like we initially got into this because this was not something that was being talked about in at least the Irish fitness circle. I know it was a bit more in the American and to some extent the British circle, which is kind of strange now because the Americans, I feel like they were kind of way ahead with a lot of things in like the early 2010s, like the early 2000s. And now I feel like the American fitness industry is it's just stopped there, you know? And I feel like the UK fitness industry is just like exploding with way better, like, first of all, talent, way better approaches, knowledge, etc., which is interesting. I don't really follow a huge amount. Maybe Australia is fucking coming out. I don't know, fucking maybe China is coming out with fucking great stuff. I don't know. I don't speak Chinese. So whatever. Anyway, that's a tangent. So the metabolic stuff, really important to understand. However, there are a few other things that I want to just touch on because we've talked about it in another area. So we're not going to do a deep dive in all of those things. But in terms of metabolism, Gary, do you have anything else to say on that?
No, sir. That's good for me.
Fantastic. Now, some of these are medical conditions. And as we've discussed, most people don't have medical conditions. Well, that's a lie. Most people do have some medical conditions, but most people like to be like, oh, my fat loss, it didn't occur because I have these medical conditions. And in reality, they've never actually got those medical conditions like diagnosed. They're just like, oh, I heard that, like thyroid. I'm going to go for the first one, hypothyroidism, right? People go, oh, like that's what I have. That's why my fat loss didn't work, right? Hypothyroidism obviously makes fat loss harder, right? It is part of something that regulates your metabolism. If you have lower metabolic rate due to lower thyroid, and again, like extremely simplified when I say thyroid, but if you have lower thyroid, like this is something that is going to impact on your fat loss, right? And thyroid levels do change with fat loss or weight loss, and like they do generally lower, unless obviously you're very metabolically deranged individual and you get into a healthy weight range, and then it can go around the opposite way than we normally consider when you lose weight. But generally, when you eat less calories, your thyroid goes down. Again, thyroid is a broad category, right? So that's something to be aware of. However, most people do not have hypothyroidism, right? Like most people are not walking around, they're like, I fucking, my hands and toes and fucking everything else are cold. They feel like icicles. Like they're not going around with all the classic like hypothyroidism symptoms. And if they were to go get a blood panel looking at their fucking hormone levels, they're not going to see like, yeah, they might be on a lower end than when they were, you know, gaining weight or whatever, but most people are not going into this like hypothyroid, you know, level, right? So that's not the first jump. That's not the first conclusion. If you're like, why did my fat loss not work? The first conclusion is not, it's because of your thyroid, okay? And if that is your first conclusion, you think that, the conclusion is not to just say that. The conclusion is to go to the doctor and then get on thyroid medication because you need it, you know? That's the first thing. Do you have anything to say on the old thyroid?
No, I mean, it goes down. If it's actually clinically relevant, your doctor will test for it and you'll be managed accordingly. But the prevalence of hypothyroidism is not nearly as high as people would assume. You know, everyone likes to think, oh, I probably have hypothyroidism, but like probably not.
Yeah, and like I've literally coached so many people with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. You know, it's like this is an actual medical condition, like an autoimmune condition, and all of them have been on medication. So they all have low, quote unquote, low thyroid, and they just supplement thyroid as a result, you know, and none of them then have a hard time with fat loss, you know. So if you are in the camp that you think, oh, I just have a thyroid condition, then it behooves you to go to your doctor, get that proven, and get on medication for it, right? And as we've discussed previously in the obesity series, in terms of like medications and supplements and whatever else, like the pharmacology of fat loss, people often think like, oh, I'll just supplement with thyroid because that'll help with fat loss. And that's not really the way it works in individuals with, you know, healthy, normal levels of thyroid. Generally, it just leads to heart palpitations or heart issues, which is no bueno when you're trying to get healthier. You know what I mean? So the next thing then is I can't even speak. I'm going to lump all of these kind of together. The first one is like PCOS. That can make fat loss a lot harder purely by virtue of the PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Like that can make it harder by virtue of making that individual more insulin resistant, right? And there are obviously other conditions that can make you more insulin resistant, and this can just make it a little bit harder and make fat loss slower, we'll say, right? Now it's probably more of an issue when you are gaining or you're trying to gain, because it's like this kind of makes you more favorably gain body fat than other places. But either way, it can be an issue. It can make fat loss a little bit harder. So it is something to be aware of. Again, if you have PCOS, like you might have to do different approaches, such as like lower carbohydrate approaches. Like that's not generally what I would recommend for a fat loss phase. I'd be like, let's keep carbs as high as possible because we know they impact on all of these other things, leptin, etc. But it might be worth a chance in trying it for someone with insulin resistance secondary to like PCOS and stuff, right? What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, I'm no expert in PCOS, but I'm on the ball with what you said. I guess just one thing to note is that like very often people kind of use PCOS and PCO or polycystic ovaries synonymously, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So the syndrome and the presence of cysts on the ovaries, they don't necessarily always go together. So insulin resistance is not necessarily tied with the fact that you have cysts on your ovaries. So that is something to speak with your doctor about, obviously. And again, like it is something that actually requires diagnosis as well, because what I've seen with some people is that they might have been told that they have an ovarian cyst from their doctor, and then they read about PCOS online, and then they're they think, all right, I have that, so I'm insulin resistant and I need to do these things. Whereas I have a couple of clients actually with PCOS, or even just ovarian cysts and no insulin resistance, no issues with that or anything. So just speak to your doctor.
Yeah, and this is important as well, because like they're like, especially with female problems, I shouldn't even call it a problem, female issues, I suppose. Like female physiology is just fucking crazy. It just like you think you know something, and then it just goes, no, actually in this position it's completely different, So it's like you have to really know what you're talking about with this stuff, and it isn't the case of you can just fucking have a shotgun approach and read about PCOS and think like, oh yeah, like that's me. Like I know people with PCOS and they are literally leaner than fucking me, and it's like maybe you do have some insulin resistance, but it's like you are managing this incredibly well. So like, do you technically then not have PCOS because you don't have this component? It's like, but you do have like cysts on your ovaries. And then I also know, like you said, Gary, other individuals that have been told they have cysts on their ovaries or a cyst on their ovary or whatever, and it's like that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be going off researching about PCOS, because they're not necessarily the same thing. This could be completely benign. You could have no other symptom of PCOS, you know. But anyway, look, that's a discussion for another day with someone who's actually an expert in the topic, not two idiots as ourselves. Another thing, again, similar situation with this, menopause can play a role in terms of making it harder to lose fat. And there's a huge variety of reasons for that, which we're not going to get into in this podcast. But one of them is that you can potentially have reduced muscle mass, which then interacts with your basal metabolic rate. And obviously there are changes in hormones at that time, which can make like actual like lipolysis, like actually like, you know, breaking down fat and stuff. It can make it harder. So that is something to be aware of. Just on that topic, like this, it's kind of weird as well, because like a lot of like say progestins and stuff, a lot of like drugs that bodybuilders take, you know, like, and also like a lot of drugs that women take for like oral contraceptives can potentially interact with this. Like all those like progestogens and stuff that are in like oral contraceptive, like they're like 19 more derivatives. They're basically fucking like, you know, the same hormones that bodybuilders take anyway, but that's another story. Like they can potentially make fat loss harder. Now, is that to say that your oral contraceptive is the reason that you find fat loss hard? No, not necessarily. It depends on what exactly we're talking about, because it's not like oral contraceptives are all the exact same. Like there's a huge variety in the actual drugs themselves, but then also how you respond to those drugs, you know? So again, this is one of those things where you can't just say like, oh, I can't take the oral contraceptive because it's going to make me fat, or it's going to hinder my fat loss, or whatever. It's like, that's not necessarily the case. And again, that's something that you have to weigh the pros and cons of as an individual in consultation with your doctor, you know. And if it is something that you think is hindering your results in terms of like, I don't know, you went on some birth control method and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I found that, I don't know, I gained 5 pounds or 10 pounds or whatever it is. And you're like, oh, it was really hard to lose weight now. I used to be able to, you know, lose weight faster or whatever. It's like, again, that's something that you need to weigh the pros and cons of and consult with your doctor about. You know, don't just listen to two idiots again on a podcast, right? And if you're interested in that stuff, Lyle McDonald's The Woman's Book, or Women's Book, the Women's Book, highly recommend it, you know. And that's where you'll find all of your answers. Now, Lyle is not a doctor, so I shouldn't say all of your answers, because you're still going to need to talk to your doctor about this stuff. But anyway, do you have anything else to say on that, Gary?
No.
Fantastic, right? And then also any disease states that make you more insulin resistant, they're going to potentially play a role in making fat loss harder, right? Old age is another one, generally because you get sarcopenia, which is not great, you know. And then there's obviously other things as well that you could potentially go into, but realistically, they're not something that it is. Will you stop looking off screen? You're giving me distractions over here.
My incredible girlfriend just brought me tea and homemade cookies. So
your better half, you mean?
Public appreciation.
She didn't even come on camera. I hate to see it. But yeah, look, there's thousands of other potential reasons, but the major reason for most people why they lose with fat loss, or they're like, oh, it doesn't even work, it's because their metabolism changes over time. You know, it's like, this is not a static thing. Most people do not have some sort of issue, some sort of disease state, some sort of illness, some sort of, you know, whatever. Most people, it literally is just a case of their NEAT goes down, or they now weigh less, or in reality, and again, as I said earlier on, this is arguably one of the biggest things that goes wrong, and that is that people just don't know how to set up fat loss diets correctly, right? That's like, why do people fail with fat loss? Well, they went on a poor fat loss diet. That's the reason. You know, it's like they tried to eat 1,000 calories per day, or their idea of a fat loss diet is like, let me consume as few calories as possible and hope for the best. Like that was the diet, you know, and like that's not not a successful, you're not setting yourself up for success with that diet. You're basically going like, how long can I sustain this? How long can I survive this? And hope to see fat loss as a result of that, right? And those are the same diets that are probably going to get the worst metabolic adaptations, because you're eating 1,000 calories when you're supposed to be eating 2,000, and all of a sudden you're like, I was losing a kilo per week initially, and now I'm losing nothing, you know? So that is something to be aware of. And realistically, that is the problem with fat loss. Most people just don't know how to do fat loss correctly. No fault of their own. I don't know why people assume just because they eat food that they would know how to structure a fat loss diet, right? You know, it's like, this is information you need to understand. Like, you wouldn't just go in and go, oh, I know how to, I don't know, fucking run the ESB or the electrical service in your town or whatever. Like, why would you think you know how to do that? Like, why would you just inherently go like, oh yeah, of course I know how to, you know, manipulate all these things? You wouldn't, right? You need an education to start with. So why is it any different with fat loss, right? So you need to get an education to get that. I would argue the best way to do it is to get a coach. Obviously, I would argue that because that's a service that we sell. But if you're not going, oh, I don't want to go down. We do, yes, we do have spaces. But obviously, if you do not want to go down that route, you can also get it from books, listen to a podcast, etc. Right? But yeah, look, I don't really have anything else to say. That's realistically the reasons that people fail in fat loss. Fat loss, like, do fat loss diets work? Yes. Do they work for most people? No. Is it because of some physiological trick where their body goes, oh, yeah, fuck you, like, we're not losing fat? To an extent, sometimes you do get these metabolic adaptations, but they're usually as a consequence of, first of all, you just having an adaptive metabolism, or usually as a consequence of just poor diet practices in general and not setting things up correctly. Like, the adaptive metabolism, even though we led with that, like, that's realistically less of an issue than the vast majority fail diets, because they set the diets up very poorly. And ultimately, on that second point of, do fat loss diets work, they generally don't work long term, because fat loss diets are not weight maintenance diets. Fat loss diets are not healthy eating diets. Like, we can set them up better to set ourselves up better for long term, you know, weight maintenance, etc. But that doesn't inherently mean that the diet that we use to lose fat is going to be the diet that we use forever, you know? So we need to keep that distinction in mind. We need to have a better understanding that your diet is going to change based on your goal. And just because you eat a certain way right now, that doesn't mean you're going to need to eat that way for the rest of your life. Do you have anything else to say, Gary?
I suppose the only thing, given the topic of discussion, if you have a better half who delivers you homemade chocolate chip cookies, that's certainly a barrier to fat loss. Thankfully, I'm on the bulk train, so it's absolutely welcome. Because I was just thinking on this podcast as we were talking, God, I have 1,100 calories to eat, and I'm supposed to be going to bed within the next hour. So this is welcome. So yeah, I'm dealing with the metabolic adaptations on the other side of the spectrum.
And that's unfortunate. That's definitely unfortunate for Laura, because you always piss sweat at night when you're bulking.
It's actually disgusting. Like, honestly, I make myself feel sick at this point, genuinely swimming. It's even worse now with jiu-jitsu, because it's the first time I've been overfeeding for ages. And now when I train in the gi, like, it's just revolting. Like, it's just an unhealthy amount of sweat. So yeah, it's great.
I can't wait for July. Like, when you're fucking doing jiu-jitsu in the heat in July, like our club, I don't know about your club, but it's like, you know, there's windows in it and everything, but there's not, you know, it's not very well ventilated. Let's just say that, you know, and you just pump sweat. Like, that gi, literally, you take it off, it's about 5 kilos, 10 kilos even heavier than when you put it on, just because it's fucking drenched with sweat.
Yeah, and I'll probably be on about 4,800 calories by then as well. So it'll be great. Anyway, that's this podcast, guys. Firstly, we do have coaching spaces available, okay? And I mean this very sincerely, but we will actually be probably closing our coaching service in 3 weeks' time for the rest of the summer, because we are pretty much at capacity or getting close to it. And as a result, like our clients don't just stay on for a month, like they stay on for longer periods of time. So we're very likely to be booked up then until around August or September. So if you are interested in working with us over the summer period, do get in touch. The gyms in Ireland are open on June 7th, and we're planning on closing our coaching spaces around June 12th. So we'd highly recommend that if you're interested in getting involved at the return of the gyms, to at least get in touch with us and book in a call with us so that we can discuss the prospect of coaching rather than waiting to that last minute, because you may not get a space. So yeah, if you're interested, get in touch. Also, we do have the Coaches Corner, which is education for trainers. So if you're interested in that, you can subscribe and access content on the type of thing that we discussed in this podcast and a lot more too. So that's definitely something that's of value. You can subscribe to our Triage Method newsletter. You can join our free Triage Method community on Facebook, and you can also follow us along on social media. We do post on our Triage Method social media, on Instagram in particular. We do also have our own social media profiles, myself, Skinny Gaz, Paddy at The Real Paddy Farrell, and Brian at Brian Hengus. So we do put out valuable content there that you guys should be following along with. So yeah, other than that, guys, make sure to leave a rating and review on the podcast if you happen to have a platform that allows you to do so. If not, or even if you do, you could also share it on your story on Instagram or whatever social media you use. It's always helpful. And if you have any questions that you'd like to submit in relation to the podcast, you can also submit those in the description box below.
Fantastic, Gary. Anyway, guys, we'll see you in the next one.